Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's Tech Talk, Proactively Manage Supply Chain Disruptions with Configit Ace. I'm joined today by Tom Davidson, Principal Sales Engineer at Configit. Our Tech Talk today should take about 30 minutes, and in the interest of time, I'd like to ask all attendees to please ask their questions in the control panel, and we will collect them and address them at the end with a short Q&A. And so with that, I will now hand it over to Tom.
Perfect. Thank you, Kirsten. Today, we're going to talk about how you can proactively manage your supply chain disruptions with Configit Ace. What we see is this becoming more of a prevalent thing as time goes on. And to kick it off, I found a quote that I just really can relate to. And it doesn't matter whether you're talking about supply chain disruptions or implementing new software. I think it speaks across a whole wide array of different focus areas. The late Jonathan Burns, who was a distinguished lecturer at MIT, contributed to over 200 publications and works over the course of his career and with regards to supply chain management. And he has this quote that I find very perfectly suited. And it says, "Many supply chains are perfectly suited to the needs that the business had 20 years ago." Now, I know that I get it. It's hard to stay ahead on technology. It's hard to stay ahead on what's the latest processes and how to manage things the most efficient. But that's really where a lot of us find ourselves in. So we're going to go through this in a sequenced process. We're going to talk about the reality check that we're in today. It's not a matter of if, but when we're going to face supply chain disruptions. How to look at it from a maturity model perspective. So how do you adapt? How do you go from a reactive to a proactive approach? We're going to talk about the CLM advantage, how you can really get ahead of those supply chain disruptions. And then, of course, being future ready. How do you progress through that maturity model? And what could potentially be the next stage of how to manage supply chain disruptions? So let's go ahead and start with the reality check. The reality is, it's the new normal. So just like we heard from that quote, it's been 20 plus years where most of us really haven't updated our processes. We haven't really advanced on how to effectively manage all of their supply chain disruptions. So what's happened in the last 20 plus years to cause this shift? I can think of three key things. The first of those is sourcing visibility. A lot of us, as the World Wide Web became easier to navigate, to do business, we've shifted from a local supplier to more of a global supplier. So we have longer lead times, less predictability, really a lot more of a waiting game. And the least fragile piece of the whole web can really impact your lead times and delivery, especially as we see here in this image. Then, of course, the second key thing is customer demands. In the last 20 years, we've seen a pretty big shift from build to stock to more of a massed customization. Even major shoe manufacturers are now offering basically build your own shoes and they'll manufacture them for you. Customer choice, customers win, where they get basically anything they want on demand. It's become the new normal for expectations. So that makes it harder to navigate with your supply chain. And then finally, the last thing is just the increased volatility in the market. Now, this could be anything from COVID and pandemics all the way to tariffs and navigating through political awareness. And these are just constant disruptions that we're dealing with on a more frequent, more casual occurrence. So it's something that we have to accept and it's something we have to adapt to. So where are we at and how do we manage that? That's where we're going to talk about the maturity model. So the maturity model we have here is all about recognizing the challenges you have with regards to supply chain and your configuration management, your configuration product models. So let's go ahead and start with level one. Level one is essentially reactive firefighting. You really don't have anything in place. You have no processes, really no configurator. This is really kind of like your entry-level business where everything's done manually and you only recognize there's a problem far after it's a problem. You're really in that firefighting mode. And of course, for configuration management, there really isn't one here because you don't really necessarily have a configurator at level 1. When we get to level 2, this is where we start to focus more on getting all of that data into a system. It may be disconnected, but you have processes that exist and you have rules defined to some degree, but you're in a patchwork response mode. So you may have a configuration model, a configurator, and your rules are in place, but they're buried in these legacy applications, or a lot of times what I see, Excel spreadsheets. That's a very big one. But you don't have any formal way to version those. So you end up with all these siloed, disparate systems where the different departments don't necessarily talk to each other. So if there is a supply chain disruption, it's really hard to pivot and react because now you have engineering, sourcing, and sales all reacting in different applications and different timings. Level 3 might look very familiar to everyone because I would imagine a majority of you in this audience are probably in that level 3 phase, where you have planned reactive responses to your configuration model and configuration management. This is really where you're able to adapt to disruptions, but it's still a reactive process. You're not necessarily getting ahead of it, but you can adapt fairly quickly. This is where you have data sources across multiple departments that are starting to become aligned, and you're starting to track the data. You're starting to track changes. But one of the big things that you have here is it still requires manual coordination. You don't necessarily have all the integrations in place, and you may copy and paste data from your ERP into your CPQ, into your configuration model in order to observe those changes. So there's still a bit of a lag. It's not quite as streamlined as you would like it to be, but in reality, this works just fine for a majority of us. However, it becomes much more of a challenge when we get hit with those big supply chain disruptions. And that's where we start to get into level 4 and level 5. Level 4 is really the start of the CLM journey, the CLM experience. This is where we start to have planned disruptions and you have those alternate parts available and in place. You're adaptive resilient. So being able to have events and effectivity in place so that you can plan out and react ahead of time to the supply chain disruptions. Really being able to map out what the future tells. And of course, you're going to be able to have versions traced and traceability across your product configuration models so that when a supply chain disruption does happen, you're able to track back in time. Also, in the future as well, you can do proactive testing so that you can understand how different things may impact your system. Also, you're going to have a lot of alternative parts in place so that you can navigate this global supply chain and be able to react a little bit more appropriately. This is really where you're reacting on a dime. You have a couple of integrations in place and it's starting to come together a lot smoother. However, it's still pretty much reacting at that moment. You're not necessarily getting fully ahead of it. You're able to get a little bit ahead of it though. And then level 5 is really kind of where everyone aims to be. That's the multi-tier resilience. So being able to understand that all of the departments are working together. All of your integrations are in place so that you can streamline the data between different systems, your ERP, your PLM, your CLM, being able to work that configuration model so that as changes occur in other systems, they're streamlined automatically between them. But the real value here on level 5 is being able to do simulations and stress tests. So when we talk about this, what you can do utilizing solution space, you're able to do proactive testing and you're able to understand your high risk supply chain components. So if you happen to have a critical component that's in 80% of your configurations that are possible, being able to visualize that will help you to understand which components you should focus on so that you can have alternate parts, so that you can have additional stock in place. This is where you really get the insight into being able to understand how to plan for when that supply chain disruption occurs. So let's go through a little short practical example. In this case, it's a magnet shortage, specifically a neodymium magnet supply chain shortage, which your company is currently purchasing from overseas. So it takes a couple of weeks to get in. It's really not a short lead time item, and it really has hit you hard whenever this shortage occurs. And let's say that your company makes variable speed drive motor assemblies. They rely on these neodymium magnets to be able to pull the power and torque from it. So they're a big critical component of all of your products. They're required in almost every assembly. So how do we react to this? Well, we have a couple of options. The first option, which is the most common, is that you try to quickly source an alternative supplier that's local in the United States or wherever you may be locally around the world. You can try to find a different grade, a lower temperature performance. It will make the grade for what you need. However, you may not be able to guarantee the same warranty to your customers. So there are different ways you can handle this if you can't find an identical match from a local supplier. The second option is you can always switch to a ferrite magnet. So it's going to impact your torque and speed curves, but it's a cheaper alternative and you can promote those to your customer. So if you as a company offer both the neodymium magnet motors and also the ferrite version, you can promote the ferrite version. It's going to be a little bit cheaper and it'll help offset some of that supply chain for your customers. Now, not every customer is going to be able to use that because they may need a certain torque and speed requirement curve in order to meet their needs. However, this can help offset some of that disruption. And then the last thing is you could always switch to a different type of magnet, but the reality is you may have to re-engineer the housing, you may have to have different thermal properties, you may have to mount them differently in order to accommodate those different magnets, especially because in this case, these particular magnets are a little bit more brittle than the normal ones. So let's look at it now from a technical perspective. If we just assume that we are going to substitute out magnets. So in this case, we started with the N48SH, which stands for super high temp magnet, and we're going to switch over to a local supplier that has N48H, which is a high temp magnet in place. So we're going to get roughly the same magnet. It's going to have a little bit lower thermal properties in terms of being able to offer that. So our warranty offering might go down slightly, but we could offer it to our customers and do a quick change out to keep production flowing. So let's look at it from this maturity stage perspective. Level one, really nothing's going on here. You send out a company email to sales and manufacturing, letting them know of the challenge, letting them know what they need to sell and not sell. But from an application perspective, there's really nothing going on here that you have to manage. And it's because your company may not be mature enough to have these processes in place. You may not even have a configurator at this level. With level two, this is where you do have defined rules. So you have a configurator in place, you have the logic, but you basically do destructive revisions. So what I mean by destructive revisions is you just go inside and you change the code. So in this case, the magnet used to be N48SH. Now you just go in and change it so it's N48H. So you've lost revision history. You've lost the ability to trace what has happened through that process, but it just gets you through. You make the change, you distribute, and release to your team so that they have a new version of the software so that they can build it and it can be sold. Level three is where you start to get into this kind of pre-planning. You start to really think through how it's going to impact your customers and impact your sales team. And this is the planned reactive. That's where you update your logic and rules with timestamps. As an example, it's a temporary fix, but it does work. So you can see in this example, if the date, let's say that supply chain shortage happens on May 15th, and you know you're going to get the neodymium magnets back in stock on August 2nd, then you can plan in advance by adding in some sort of time-stamped code. So saying, you know, if the date is between these two, we're going to use the N48H magnet. Otherwise, we're going to use our preferred N48SH magnet. So being able to proactively manage this will help a little bit. It also helps with release of your code, and it's really being able to proactively plan for the reincorporation of this magnet back into your supply chain. Level 4, like I said before, is really when we start to get into this configuration lifecycle management approach. This is where you're going to add in events and effectivities, and we'll talk about these in a second. This is where you put in different programs inside of your configuration model so that you can manage them from a single object or a single element inside of the tool. That's going to allow you to respond a lot quicker. And if you have to change the date, you just can go through and make one change rather than changing the date everywhere you see it. And then level 5, like I said, this is where you really focus in on identifying the risks for your supply chain. You're also going to add in integrations across all the different systems. It's a smooth flowing system where you're going to be able to really anticipate what could be problematic and how to quickly adapt when it does happen. So here you're going to start to look at relationships, and something else we're also going to talk about is solution space. So let's talk a little bit about what it means from the CLM or Configuration Lifecycle Management advantage when it comes to managing supply chain disruptions. So when we look at it from a level 4 perspective, we have these events inside of Configit Ace, and these events are essentially discrete dates that you're going to add to your product model to denote different actions. Now, this could be the start or the end for options that you're going to have, for example, the magnets, the rules, so when certain things are active, what compatibilities will work with each other, and of course, your different bill of material components that you may see inside of your system. Now, these are just dates at this point in time, so they're kind of very minimal advantage by themselves. That's why we combine them with effectivities inside of Configit Ace. So effectivities are where you define when something is active. It's a time range. So you can see in this example on the left, we have the N48H, where it becomes available on May 15th, and it becomes basically unavailable on August 2nd. So you're basically planning when you're going to have this utilized, and then it's kind of the polar opposite for the super high temp. We used to use it, we now have a shortage, so we need to pivot, we need to stop using it, and then we need to go back to using it once the supply chain stock comes back into possession. So it's a way to kind of plan not only the current state, but plan for the future state as well. It's kind of like those timestamps that we were talking about, where if it's between two dates, the only difference here is you're applying the dates to the objects in your configuration model. So the real benefit to this is you offer your team and organization timed precision. So when you look at it from a configuration perspective, you automatically can retire parts and activate parts on predefined dates. So being able to test not only in the past, present, and the future, by doing that, you're going to essentially reduce the errors inside of your system. You're going to ensure that your team always will have the latest version of what they need to complete the sale or complete the manufacturing job. And also, you're going to have all of your supply availability centrally managed, being able to understand when components are available and when they're out of stock. Really, the biggest thing here, though, is the reducing errors. By ensuring that you have this holistic view across systems, it's really going to help from that timed precision standpoint. And then, of course, level 5. Level 5 is where we start to get into all of the metrics and analytics to be able to proactively understand, estimate, and really define what those supply chain disruptions would do from a organizational perspective. So here we start talking about relationships. Those are essentially just visual mappings of how your product model options, rules, and components all work together, how they're related, and what impacts what. You can also identify usages across the product model. And this is great because if you have a supply chain disruption and you need to pivot in your configuration model, being able to see where a particular component is used across the entire set, not only in options, but in rules and across the entire landscape of your configuration model, that's a big advantage. You don't have to hunt and peck for everywhere a variable is used. You just essentially look at a component and say where it's used, and it'll be able to identify for you the impact to your landscape and to your supply chain. And then the last thing here is called solution space. This is potentially the end stage of where you would love to be because it allows you to take a look at your entire possible valid permutation list. So all of the configurations that you can offer your customer, solution space essentially pre-compiles all of those options into a single view so that you can understand what are the valid permutations, and when you compare that or combine that with your prevalence, how likely something is to be selected, how likely it is to be a part of the configuration, you now have this really great view of understanding and pairing it with ERP data where you can understand your high-risk components. So as you can see in this particular instance here, we have the rare earth magnet. It's listed as a high prevalence because it's used essentially in every motor. And of course, the volatility, it's now become listed as a high volatility object or component because of the supply chain shortage. So understanding what is a risky component will allow you to proactively source out alternate suppliers, being able to have a little bit of extra supply stock so that you can navigate for if or when these different supply chain disruptions occur. From a benefit perspective, relationships really allow that 100% accurate change management. It allows you to identify all the related sources and usages so you don't have to hunt and peck through the system. It's really an easy way to identify things without doing too much in-depth work. And then from the solution space perspective, this is where we want to quantify your disruption impact by observing how much of the solution space is impacted. So you'll get the solution space, which shows you all of the options, and it's going to let you know immediately what is the prevalence, how often is this used, and that'll help you to identify those high-risk supply chain components and constraints. So let's talk about getting future ready. Getting future ready could mean a multitude of things depending on where you are in your maturity model. So if we go back to our maturity model real quick, from reactive firefighting all the way through to the multi-tier resilience, what we need to do is we need to evolve our organization. Now, I'd love to say you could just leapfrog straight to level 5, but the reality is it is a bit of a progression. You may be able to do a little bit of leapfrogging, but the reality, you have to take it one step at a time. Hopefully no one's at level 1. But if you are, getting to level 2 just means documenting all of your configuration rules and your bill of material changes. And of course, you start to want to foster the collaboration between departments. To go from level 2 to level 3, this is really where you want to start on centralizing your configuration logic and the rules across your platforms. You want to start doing version control, and you want to start identifying alternate parts and suppliers so that you can proactively react to the first degree. Level 3 to level 4, this is where you want to start to introduce events and effectivity. Like I said, the start of the journey for the CLM experience. You want to start to integrate your data across multiple systems, and you want to add in conditional-based triggers to be able to manage these version control alternatives. And then level 4 to level 5, you want to essentially have all of those integrations in place. You want to make sure that you really have a good, solid understanding of how your data gets transferred across your systems, from your sales team to your sourcing to engineering, so that you can have visibility and real-time analytics across all of your platforms. Also, implementing a goal-based configurator to be able to guide users to the best alternative, so that if you do have a supply chain disruption, you can advise customers what is their best alternative until you have your part back in stock. a lot of times that'll work for your customers. And then of course, solution space to model the impact and identify those high risk components. So what happens after level 5? Is that it? Well, not quite. So level 6 maybe, potentially, could be predictive analytics. Now, this is something that is really on the cusp of the next phase of configuration management, but essentially what you need to do, you need to consider and understand your supplier's solution space. So think about this way. If you have your organization set up perfectly and everything's running smooth, you're still reacting to when there's a supply chain shortage to some degree. But if your suppliers are set up to the same level of success that you are, now you are both streamlined, meaning that the disruption is going to impact everyone downstream far significantly less. You can also supplement your solution space with external data sets, lead times, geopolitical risk scores, a whole host of other data sets that'll really help you to understand and optimize what your risk definition is. And then finally, we all have heard AI. It's the new buzz of the 21st century. And of course, being able to utilize machine learning or AI to predict buyer trends and help to promote new configuration options to your customers that will meet their needs and minimize the risk to you. That's all for right now. I'm open for questions.
Yep, we do have a few. Let me just pick a couple. I think we have time for one, maybe two. Okay, first question. What is the difference between events and just adding timestamps into the model?
Yeah, that's a great question. So events combined with effectivity, that's really at the core of configuration lifecycle management. Adding in a timestamp is good, but what happens is when you add in a timestamp into your code or into your platform, essentially you have to add that timestamp in every location. So if you fat finger a date, or if the date changes, so the supplier calls you up and they say, hey, we told you August 2nd, we had a little bit of a hiccup. It's actually going to be August 29th. What you can do is in traditional systems, you have to go back and you have to do a find and replace, find them all, replace them all. And of course, the big thing there is being able to understand what is the impact if you changed one of the dates incorrectly. So here, what we do with events and effectivity, it's one location. So if your date changes, you only have to change that event date and it propagates through your entire system. It's a much cleaner approach to managing changes inside the system.
Great, thank you. I think one last question. How does solution space work? Do you import data from your ERP to assess supply chain risks?
Yeah, so with regards to solution space essentially works by giving you a data set of all the possible valid combinations or permutations for your configuration model. You don't necessarily import data from your ERP. What you do is you can combine it or you can extract data and be able to utilize your data inside your ERP system. So by combining your solution space from your configuration model with the data from your ERP, you're able to get this really holistic view of how your structure and organization is set up for success or failure by understanding all of the pricing, all of the lead times, all of your inventory. It's going to help to educate you on what is the most prevalent, what is the highest risk. It's really kind of this next level analysis of your organization with regards to your configuration level.
Perfect, thank you. We are right at 10:30, so I think we will wrap it up today. There will be a short survey at the conclusion of the webinar. It'd be great if you could fill that out. And a recording will also be available on our website in the coming days. So with that, I'd like to thank everybody for attending and have a great rest of your day.